Our next speaker, Michael Alexander, qualified speaker in 2 districts, District 100 and District 12. Actions have consequences, but these consequences are not often the ones that we thought they would have. Sometimes they make things better than expected, sometimes worse, and sometimes they may affect something which seems completely unrelated. As a result, one can solve a problem, but create new and worse problems. Our next speaker will be Dr. Michael Alexander, manager, problem solver, and policymaker. And over the course of his career, he observed a number of well-intentioned solutions that nevertheless did not work out as expected. And some of these unexpected consequences are still out there waiting to happen, unless we do something to nip them in the bud. In his presentation, he will share some of these and some other observations on what can be done to keep the best of intention from going awry. Michael Alexander, unintended consequences. Welcome to the land of unintended consequences. Michael Alexander.
On the first day of my first class in economics, the professor told a story. And he said, if you want to be an economist, you have to understand this story. And he began by sending only men to the Virginia colonies. The chances of success of the colonies were improved. Immediately, you could feel tension in the room as people were upset at this obviously chauvinistic statement. But he'd said I had to understand it if I wanted to be an economist, and I wanted to be. So I figured it couldn't hurt to listen. And so he proceeded by sending only men to the Virginia colonies. England was left with a large number of old maids. Now in England, old maids keep cats. Cats kill rats. Rats, which had they lived, would have brought down the bee population in England. Bees, which because they did live, were able to cross-pollinate the clover and grass eaten by the cows of England. Cows who provided the beef, which was shipped to the American colony. Healthier cows, healthier beef, healthier men, a better chance of survival of the Virginia colonies. Now, those people who'd stopped listening and as soon as they heard the chauvinistic statement missed the point. And the real point of that story is that you have to keep listening and you have to keep thinking. People who stop at their conclusion, this is chauvinistic, I don't want to hear it, miss the important reality of going from men to old maids to cats to rats to better cows to better survival. We live in a society where we think very quickly, what is the solution? What is the consequences? And as a result, we make a number of serious mistakes. Well, sometimes things work out well, but let me give you a very recent example from me. My wife wanted to take out the old trees lining our backyard and put up fruit trees because she wanted the beauty of fruit trees. And so we took the trees down. Wonderful. We put up fruit trees. Very nice. And then everybody was happy until my neighbor's air conditioner started running. And lacking the sound buffering of those trees that had been, my wife was kept awake all night because she didn't think through the question, of what the trees actually did. And that's the kind of problem we face all too often. Now, another example of an unexpected consequence on a subject people hadn't even thought about, and this one positive, was when Alexander Fleming was working on a small biology experiment. Alexander Fleming was the discoverer of penicillin. And because there was a small mistake and the dish was not cleaned properly, a little piece of mold got into it. And it killed off all of the bacteria which Fleming was trying to study. The result? Penicillin. No one expected penicillin. No one had ever thought of it. But it happened. Now, years later, Alexander Fleming was shown a beautiful modern facility. Wonderful. Everything was clean, sterile, scientifically controlled. And the man who ran that lab said to him, "Imagine what you could have discovered in this laboratory." To which Alexander Fleming replied, "Certainly not penicillin." Other examples of stories actually wind up being quite different, but on the same subject as people intended. In New Zealand, they were very concerned by the fact that men had an easier time getting employed than females. And so they said, how do we handle this? Well, let us remove by law all references on the resumes and applications which tell people what the sex of the applicant is. Anyone want to guess what happened? The exact opposite of what was intended. Because there are reasons why the resumes may explain differences. Why did a woman take a softer track? Why did the employee take time off? Because it was a woman taking care of her children. It wasn't because she couldn't be employed. It wasn't because she wasn't taking work seriously. But if you don't know that, all you know is these two employees, one seems to take work seriously, one seems to take a lot of time off. And as a result, the one who worked more seriously, who is the male, gets hired because we don't understand why. You ever wonder what happens when we make cars more energy efficient? There's a reason why we want cars more energy efficient. Very simple one. We want to decrease pollution. And so we make cars more gas efficient. You know what happens when cars are more gas efficient? I'll give you a hint. It's cheaper to drive them. And as a result, people say, hey, I can drive more miles for the same price. So they do. And all the advantages you got from the energy efficiency disappear. In fact, the reverse happens. As people get longer distances driven, they can afford a second car, or maybe even a third car for their children. And so instead of getting less pollution, which is what we intended, we get more. There was an idea. Well, we've all heard about greenhouse gases. Anybody here who's never heard of the greenhouse gas effect? Raise your hand. And 2 of you. Okay. I'd like to ask those of you who have to explain to me the chemistry which causes carbon dioxide to reflect more heat into the atmosphere, because that's the theory, that like a greenhouse, the heat enters, bounces off the earth, hits the cloud layer or the ozone layer, and then bounces back, which means that the earth is hotter. This is what we all know, right? We've all thought it through. We know this makes sense. Any of you know why carbon emissions would create a bigger greenhouse gas bounce? No. No scientist has ever told you that. You probably only know it's true because you went to watch a movie by a former vice president and assumed that an Academy Award, which is given for entertainment value, meant that it had more scientific value. Think about that question. Entertainment value is mistaken for scientific value. That, my friends, is an unintended consequence of an Academy Award. Now, I'm not going to talk about the greenhouse bounce per se, but I want you to think whenever you're told something or everyone knows it, but maybe they don't. You know what the advantage of the scientific journals are? The refereed scientific journals? They mean that the referees get to put their opinions in and call them scientific. And those people who aren't popular enough to be referees don't get to. Which means that the intention of making things more scientific may in fact limit what science brings you. But enough of a diatribe on scientific unintended consequences. Let us talk instead about the idea that we will reduce carbon emissions. I worked in the energy industry, so forgive me if I wax a little long on this subject. I worked in the electric industry when they decided we should use natural gas to generate electricity because it had less carbon emissions. And it does. And that's where we stopped. Carbon is bad. Reduce carbon emissions. Things are good. Did we think it through? No. Because gas has methane emissions, and methane is a worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And that's why some of you have heard this threat that the Democrats want to take your gas stoves away from, because we're realizing that natural gas may be a worse problem than the one it solved. Or, as Michael Cervantes says in Don Quixote, may the cure not be worse than the disease. Well, we're getting rid of gas now. This has got to be a better thing, right? Solar. No emissions from solar. Absolutely none. Are you thinking through the whole process when you say that? Well, let me tell you two unintended consequences. First of all, solar energy uses a large number of heavy metals which leach into the water. An unintended consequence. Water pollution, a dangerous one. We're not worried about it now, but we will someday. But at least it doesn't have any gas emission. Until we put solar or even wind out in the desert where it's far away from people, because that's a good spot for it. And then we put power lines across the forest. What happens when there are forest fires because of electric power lines? All those forest fires in California, they're an unintended consequence of safe, clean wind and solar. And they pour more carbon into the atmosphere than the coal and natural gas that they replace. By the way, while I'm on the subject of trees, we wanted, roughly 100 years ago, to decrease the runoff from trees, from the rain, the erosion that happened on the mountainside. And so we planted fast-growing eucalyptus all up and down the mountain. And we stopped the erosion. We did exactly what we had in mind. It didn't occur to anybody to ask what happened 100 years later to a eucalyptus tree. Because the answer is they build up creosote. And after 100 years, the creosote becomes highly flammable. And you get forest fire. Again, we didn't think through the whole consequence. And that, my friends, is what I want you to start doing. Listening to what you're told, but then thinking, what aren't you being told? What aren't you thinking about? No one's hiding these things from you. They simply aren't thinking things through themselves. In politics, well, I hear some wonderful stories from people who trust the media. They aren't always right. I heard a story about, well, in this case, the president, the former president, who asked a whole series of well-dressed men and women to bring coffee in for the conference. The media was outraged when they discovered that these men and women were not waiters and waitresses. They were, in fact, members of the staffs of many of the senators and congressmen in that meeting. Now, nobody told the president that the staffers were going to be there. He didn't know. He made an assumption based on the way they were dressed. And a great media uproar over the way he treated it. His quick decision had an unintended consequence. The failure to inform him had an unintended consequence. And it looked like he was mistreating staffers, which is what the news reported, when in fact, he simply made an unfortunate mistake. Now, I've looked at a lot of papers and a lot of headlines online where people stop reading after the first line. And if you read the story, it's not at all what's reported. In fact, it's frighteningly wrong. YouTube shows a lot of person A is schooled by a student or an interviewee. Watch the actual interview, they're not. But people believe it. And that's serious problem. They believe they believe the story. I'll give you an apocryphal one. There was a new lion brought into the zoo, imported from Africa, that people were very delightfully pleased and all went down to see the lion. In fact, one child got too close. And as a result, the lion reached out and grabbed him and pulled him in. The lion would have eaten the child, except for a large burly biker who punched out the lion and rescued the child. The newspaper asked him for a human interest story about himself. He said, well, I run the Toys for Tots organization. I am very heavy in the Easter sales rallies to raise money for children. And, well, I'm a Republican. I am active in my church. The story read in the newspapers, Republican punches out new immigrant to the country and steals his lunch. That kind of reporting could occur. Read the story. Now, when I wanted to talk about problems for this very group, problems with understanding what was going on with emissions, with understanding the unintended consequences there, one of the people in the audience decided it was a good time to rap lackadaisical on the question of greenhouse gases, completely missing my point that we are getting wrong what's actually going on. Someone decided not to listen, but to throw statistics in our face. And as a result, I don't think that person learned that we have to be careful about what we think is happening. You need, each and every one of you, as citizens of this country and as citizens of the world, not to leap to quick conclusions, not to throw out a decision that says, hey, that's a chauvinistic statement about the Virginia colonies, but to figure out what the lesson is there and to learn from them. So I ask each and every one of you, as you go through life, ask yourself, not just what's the story, but what am I missing from the story? What's going to happen because I don't think things all the way through? And how do I avoid a knee-jerk reaction which says, these are the statistics I have, and I'm going to throw them in whether they're relevant to the story or not. This is the chauvinistic statement that the professor has made, and I don't really need to hear the point or why he thought it was important. And you see, once again, our young friend is decided to discuss carbon dioxide instead of listening because she's not picking things. I want you to think things through. I don't want you to make those kinds of mistakes. I don't want you to knee-jerk, and I don't want you to believe you have solutions just because you have something to say. Think about what can go right, what can go wrong, and how we prevent those wrong from happening. Mr. Toastmaster.